what you find again and again is people who are so committed to science that they confuse what is knowable with what is real. I want to repeat that. They confuse what is knowable through their techniques with the only possible thing that's real. And that leads them to absurdity.
How did we get here when it comes to our perspective on the mind, body, and the evidence-based practices that, at least I hope, guide our daily choices and the guidance provided by physicians, coaches, and others? How did healthcare and medicine grow from a speculative and metaphysical practice to that of reason and empirical observation? Today's guest, esteemed psychiatrist and best-selling author Dr. George Makari, will open our eyes to the intriguing path of modernity stemming from the crisis in religious authority and the scientific revolution. Along the way, we'll learn why the concept of the mind supplied a possible answer, representing part soul and part machine, but fully neither. Thank you for joining us here on the Catalyst 360 podcast, your source for engaging evidence-based health, wellness, and performance insights. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper, CEO of Catalyst Coaching 360, and we're honored to have you spend a portion of your week with us. One of the fastest growing careers is, not surprisingly, based on the value being demonstrated in the literature, health and wellness coaching. The very first small group of people completed a national board certification just a few years ago. Earlier this year, the National Board for Health and Wellness Coaching, or NBHWC, announced there are now over 10,000 board certified coaches. A lot of people out there may call themselves a health and wellness coach, but these individuals have taken the steps to demonstrate their true credibility. If you've been thinking about pursuing your NBHWC approved coach certification, either to start a new career or to expand your toolbox as a physical therapist, physician, counselor, or other clinician, Catalyst Coaching Institute might just be worth a look. Our next cohort begins soon, and you can find all the details at our institute site, catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And we get it. It is a big decision, so please, if you'd like to talk it through, please reach out to Susanna, our Chief Learning Officer. She's happy to set up some time to answer your questions. Email Susanna at catalystcoaching360.com, or her direct line is 720-339-4292. That's 720-339-4292. And now it's time to look under the hood of the soul machine with Dr. George Makari on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Dr. Makari, thank you for joining us on the show. Really been looking forward to this. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Your reason for writing a book about the mind, obviously it's your background. I've heard in other interviews you've discussed originally planning to write a history of psychiatry, but then said, no, I think I need to go deeper. Can you walk us through that journey a little bit?
Sure. So I'm part of this think tank that is focused on helping us understand contemporary problems in mental health, mental illness, psychiatry, psychology through examining the past. And so it's kind of been in my, kind of roundhouse to kind of think about how history illuminates contemporary problems. And I've written a book about the history and making of psychoanalysis, trying to foreground like the problems there in terms of strengths and problems of trying to make a science of inner life. And so, I was positioned in a way to then think about, because there wasn't any good history of psychiatry, that maybe that wasn't a project that I should take on. And, what I found was a kind of, and you learn to listen to this after a while, as I got really bored. It was really boring, and there were a bunch of the same stories that were told over and over again. And then it dawned on me that that being bored was kind of important to think about. Like, why wasn't this interesting? I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a historian of psychiatry. Why wasn't the history of psychiatry interesting to me? Right. And, what became clear to me was that, actually the guys and the ways the stories are told, they didn't seem very exciting. They didn't seem very innovative. These people didn't seem like they were super creative. And I started to kind of rethink the framework, and I came to the conclusion that the way people started the story was actually midstream, and that there was an older, deeper story that was in fact very exciting and was in fact very challenging to ways that we think about ourselves as individuals, as political citizens, as people who have to manage both, kind of religious beliefs in spiritual life and having concrete material bodies. And so suddenly a different framework made the story seem very interesting to me. And, if you're going to write a book like that takes 7 years or so, you better be interested. So I got really into it. And that's, I think, the origin of my second book, Soul Machine.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I love that. And you mentioned our son's in med school right now. And so when you were talking about some of the history and things developing and doctors and the direction they'd taken with bleedings and all that kind of stuff, let's give the listeners a flavor of one of the stories, the story of Bedlam. I read that and I just went, what? That's where that word comes from? Walk us through that story a little bit.
Well, it's it's an old asylum, and it's the full name is Bethlehem, but it's Bethel, and it's in England, and it was a very old asylum for the mentally ill, broadly put. But they didn't really have great ways of categorizing folks who were mentally ill. And so, as was going to happen in France, there were people who were maybe violent, people who were poor and destitute. And so it was a kind of, a mix of people. Now, I don't know which story you're exactly referring to, but maybe you're referring to the story about the fact that in the 17th century and then early 18th century, it became kind of like a cool thing to do, to pay a little bit of money and go tour the place and look at the mentally ill as if you were at a zoo or something. So there's a kind of like fascination that people had, and then this kind of rather crude sense and insensitive sense of like, these are people who, are not really even people. They're so dehumanized that we could look at them and enjoy it as if we're at a zoo. And so that really is a kind of prehistory to an awakening that lots of people could become mentally ill, that it was part of the human experience, and that we needed to both humanize these people and think about more moral and ethical ways of treating them, both in society and then using that to help us understand them and treat them medically.
Yeah, and just that phrase Bedlam, you think of it's used now for riots or things are going crazy or whatever, and to realize that came from Bethlehem Hospital where these folks were being served. I was not aware. I missed this in my homework about your think tank. I'd love to hear more about that. It sounds fascinating. What are you working on? Where is that going? What are things on the plate right now?
Yeah, thanks so much. So, Brad, the place, I'm at the Weill Cornell Department of Psychiatry at the Payne Whitney Clinic, and we were started in the 30s by a Swiss psychiatrist who had recognized that the complexity of the problems that we face in psychiatry with, deep relationships to social problems, et cetera, required a bunch of different kinds of research. And one that he put, his kind of weight behind is founding a section of research that started out as just really history of psychiatry. The idea being like, some of these problems are so complex, we need to understand the history of them. That'll help us understand the worst problems that we've had, the worst mistakes that we've made, and some of the more virtuous things that we've done. That'll give us some guidance. And so this started, in 1958 and preceded my arrival. I got here, I kind of was deeply interested in both being a psychiatrist and a historian and a writer. And so I actually transferred from Brown Medical School to come here to Cornell because of that institute, and ended up being its director. And now we really have broadened out our purview because we do policy stuff. We do some stuff that has to do with overlap with narrative medicine and the arts, but we still have a central core commitment to understanding the history of psychiatry. And we have an amazing library that those guys built before I got here that starts in the 15th century and goes to the present. And so a book like Soul Machine, where I had to really, read a lot in English, French, and German, it was really, really helpful because I had that huge library. And then I have colleagues who come together who were interested in the same things. And so we hopefully all elevate each other's games. I know they elevated mine. So right now, we're interested in the way that these different kinds of historical frameworks illuminate, these constant problems that we have, because psychiatry is such a difficult discipline. The mind is so difficult, the way it interacts with the brain, the way it interacts with social life. We're trying to look at resonant, important issues from history that have relevance to contemporary times, and we host scholars from around the world, and hope to push the ball forward, increasing understanding of mental health and mental illness.
And is there that's the topic right now, and I'm exaggerating that slightly, but it's right there. Are there any things that you're really focusing in on now that give us a peek into that would give folks some hope that, okay, they're not going to solve it, but maybe they can get the ball a little bit further down the field?
Yeah, look, I think we have to own up to the fact that we've made some mistakes and self-correct, and that will help us get things further down the field. So I wrote a piece in the New Yorker that was a kind of summation of some of the thoughts I've had about where we've been over the last 25 years. And, I think what we kind of best of times, worst of times in a lot of ways. I mean, we have more tools now to help treat mental illness than we've ever had before. And our capacity to deliver those treatments to both minority communities and the poor is terrible. And so we have lots of people on the street. We have lots of people who are in prisons that should be in mental health care facilities. The institutionalization has not gone well. Those people are ending up on the streets and in jail. And yet we have more tools now than we've ever had. So there's this kind of really tragic disparity. And then, we have leadership that really, I think, has failed us in some ways, because at the NIMH, which is the kind of central federal and the leading grant giver in mental health in the world, I believe, they've become very, very, very focused on genetics and neural circuits. And that's all brilliant, but it's actually done nothing to help patients. And we need a better kind of mix. One of the stories from the history of psychiatry is people get super excited about a narrow approach. And a narrow approach makes sense in science, because in science, you try to look at really complex realities and narrow them down to one thing that might change everything. That's reductionism. That's what we do in science. Look at all those things. That's all syphilis. Oh, you found out it's one spirochete. You cure this spirochete. All those weird symptoms go away. So we love to have a problem that we can fix like that. The problem is, unfortunately, the mind and brain problems haven't been soluble that way. Right. And so looking for a gene for schizophrenia has left us with hundreds of genes that have a tiny, tiny contributing factor in some cases. And yet we keep going down that road. So I really called for a reorganization of our priorities around, thinking about delivering care in a much broader way, and doing research on how we can recreate humane asylums, which I think we have to recreate in some way that isn't the old, snake pits of the past, but has the capacity to truly achieve what that word asylum in its best sense meant, which was a place that was safe, that you could recover in, and before you got reintegrated back into society. So, there are things like that that are very hot policy issues that, we really, I feel very committed to. And they're really difficult ones, and there are huge numbers of money attached and of people with political commitments attached. And so they're big, complex problems. And, I don't delude myself that, but we try to move the ball forward there as best we can.
The title of your book, and again, I enjoyed it so much. I couldn't set it down. I had planned on reading it over a long time span. It's a larger length book, and I just couldn't set it down. Exceptional. At first glance, the two words in the title, soul, machine, seem to be diametrically opposed.
Right.
How did you land on that title, and what were your intentions in bringing those two together?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, because that was my intention. My intention was to make you go, wait, those two words can't go together. How do those two words go together? And then that really is the entire book. Right. The entire book is about how, in antiquity, in the West, the body and the soul were the two parts of that made up a human being. That was, human nature was based on a body and a soul. And the story that I wanted to tell was how, especially when the body became seen as more of a machine, that this third entity for what defined human nature started to emerge, called the mind, a natural mind, not a soul, and not reduced to a machine, but something in between. And so sticking the words hard like that together was the challenge that the whole book essentially entails. And I hope that's the story that I tell, so that by the end you understand that this mind takes attributes from the old idea of the soul, takes attributes from different notions of the body, and is central to our notion of who we are now because of all that.
Let's walk down that path a little bit. The distinction between the mind and the brain, it's a big part of what you're talking about. Yet, someone like myself, a layperson, might confuse the two or intermix the two when they're talking. Can you shed some light on the distinction between the mind and the brain and the historical nature of that differentiation?
Yeah, look, that's a very big question, but it's a great question. And different people have had different positions on that. So I have to, in this book, go through the different ways people have tried to figure out what's the relationship of the thing in our head that when you do dissection, there it is, that's the brain, and inner experience that we have as we walk around every day, thinking about what we want, what we're going to do, who we're going to have dinner with tonight, and that inner experience. And, I talk about how in 18th century, especially mid 17th century to mid 18th century, there's a series of very heated debates about how you figure out what that thing is. The old answer was the inner experience is the rational soul, and the brain is part of the body. And so in the old days, when you went to a Christian Galenic doctor, he would have to figure out whether your body was sick and he was going to bleed you, or whether your soul was sick and he was going to send you to a priest for exorcisms or prayers or something like that. And what started to happen was people were doing research on the brain, and they started to claim that some of the things in the rational soul were actually brain functions, that some of those things like reason and will and memory might be in the brain. It was a dangerous thing to say because it was heresy, but people started to say it. And as it increasingly became clear that that seemed like it was true, people started to look for this in-between solution. You could be spiritual, but people like John Locke said, you can be spiritual, you can be very religious, but reason and will and memory are not part of the soul. They're not immaterial. Descartes said that they were. Descartes was the one who said that, I think, therefore I am, and that I think has nothing to do with the body. Locke said, no, actually it does have to do with the body. And a whole bunch of people started to say it is part of the brain function. We don't know how, but somehow it's part of the brain function. And how a piece of matter, a machine, could have the active power to think, that was the big mystery. Still the mystery today, by the way. No one has great explanations for that today. But we assume that without the brain, there is no mind. But the mind is an emergent function from the brain. And so with that as an assumption, you not start to think of the mind brain with a hashtag in between, a slash in between, because they are two ways of looking at the same thing, even though they reveal very different things when you look at the different angles. So that's a big part of the story. And today, I think, when I see people making generalizations about how it's got to be genetics that does this or that, it's the same old problem of reductionism in a super complex field where maybe, with Huntington's chorea, we know all it takes is that unfortunate genetic mutation. You will get Huntington's chorea. But depression, anxiety disorders, phobias, it turns out a lot of that is mental as well as brain, and we have to be able to think on both sides of that coin as psychiatrists, as psychologists, as people, as citizens, as humans who know that our environments affect us, our moods can be driven by having a bad night's sleep, but also by losing your job. And so having all of that as part of the human experience is becomes a downstream effect from having this more open view of the mind-brain relationship.
And as you were going through that your last phrase there is exactly what I was thinking, is the exercise, the way that you're eating, the sleep schedules, that kind of thing has such an impact on emotional response, on the way we interpret things, on our ability to tune into what that mind is doing. I'll just leave it open. Any comments on that or where we're going with those discoveries?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a lot of good work that's being done on that. And I think that it's true that the fact that that we have minds doesn't mean that they can't be deeply influenced by, I would say, two things. Like when John Locke started out this idea, because he's central to my book, he's the guy who really, we think of him as a political philosopher, but he's a doctor, and he had studied with the best neuroanatomists of the time. And, he basically says, like, the mind is separate from the soul. It's natural. It's somehow related to the brain. It's a thinking thing. The thing is the brain, but somehow it's a thinking thing. And he starts to coin these very important words. So he says, you go to sleep at night, you wake up, you're the same person. That's because you have a self. He coins the term. Your inner theater, that's called consciousness. A series of strings of consciousness. You wake up, you go to sleep, you wake up, same consciousness, that's a self. So he starts to put these things out there that then are natural. And because they're natural, they can also be sick, right? You can't have a notion of mental health and mental illness unless it's a natural object. So now, okay, what's going to make the mind sick? Well, it's not just a bad thought. It's anything from the brain or the body can affect our inner experience. And then there's a second added part of it. So for Locke, the mind is only conscious. But when you start to get to the German romantics and then ultimately to psychoanalysis, they say, well, actually also there's another thing, which is the unconscious mind. So now we have the body, which we're not that conscious of. Then there's the unconscious mind, which can include trauma and stuff like that. And all of that can impinge on consciousness, which, isn't just an empty receptacle. It has its own, capacities for health and illness. And now we have this tripartite thing that we think about all the time when patients come to us, like, what are the bodily things going on here? What are the psychological things, conscious or unconscious, that are going on here? What are the adaptive mechanisms and strengths that this person has? And how do we now help them? And that's kind of, the state of, I think, psychiatry. At least good psychiatrists think on all of those fronts.
Let's take a quick left turn here. The film Napoleon hit the theater last year, and that gave us a little bit of a peek into the French Revolution. You talk a lot about that. You talk about the fact that the revolution began as rational and then became emotional and thus bloody. Can you walk us through a little bit of the role of the revolution in this journey that you more broadly look at in the book?
Yeah, you're right. The French Revolution is a big part of this book because, the people that I'm writing about before the French Revolution, because they challenged the church's notion of the soul, were often people who had to flee for their lives, would write with either anonymously or with pseudonyms. The people like Hobbes and Locke, these are people who lived on the run. Descartes, these people, we don't think about them that way because they're all so famous, but they were under a great deal of threat. And people who wanted to say that maybe the mind could be ill were at loggerheads with the church, who said the soul is immortal, the soul is eternal. That is heresy. And so there's a lot work that's being done kind of in this underground way. And it only becomes legitimized socially and overground, if you will, with the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution, of course, for some period of time, for a number of decades, eliminates the Catholic Church from, its power base. So there isn't censors who are screening works anymore for things that are, anti Catholic, and the mind would have been one of them. So what do you find? You find that with the French Revolution, you have the first emergence of the person who, when I told you these boring stories, that they would always start with Philippe Pinel. It was already like, okay, Philippe Pinel started. Well, there was a revolution before Philippe, and there were all these people who lived on the run. Man, I think that's a good story. I mean, I don't live in Hollywood, but that's people who like live on the run and are taking the chance of their lives for the truth. That's a big story. The revolution happens. The church is now no longer a threat. And Philippe Pinel, starts to have a purely secular psychiatry in these huge institutions in France that were filled with the poor, the violent, and the mentally ill, the criminal. Maybe they weren't violent. I should just say the criminal, the mentally ill. And he starts to sort them out and say, like, no, we need a institution that just treats the mentally ill, and we need doctors who just do that. Because it's a natural illness. It's not soul possession. And it's both between the body and the mind. And we need to help those people. So that's the emergence of psychiatry after the revolution. What happens with Napoleon and what happens in the revolution, of course, is that it's a revolution that runs out way ahead of its original intentions. And with the Jacobins becomes, hideously violent and murderous, and like a terror state. So the initial revolution against the king swings into more and more radical groups taking over until Robespierre and the Jacobins take over, and then it's kind of like a terror state. So that is an interesting story in itself. I'm not an expert on that story, but it is fascinating to think about how revolutions can't kind of contain themselves often, right. And the most radical folks end up winning. But Napoleon was supposed to be the hero of the Enlightenment guys who, after the Jacobins collapsed, the Girondists and these kinds of more moderate secular revolutionaries took over. Napoleon famously, is going to take over Europe and is going to make all of it Enlightenment, secular, modern. And the tragedy of Napoleon was that, his invading armies did what invading armies, I suppose, do, which is they raped and they pillaged and they stole and they turned lots and lots and lots of countries against them. The German, principalities, Spain, the Italian ones, so that it became this kind of authoritarian horror show, all in the name of the Enlightenment, which was, not a great start.
Yes, indeed. No doubt. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about this during the book, the fact that so many of these thinkers, these movers of thought at the time, were on the run. And then you add to that lifespan was simply shorter. We didn't live to 85. We didn't live to 97. Yeah. And so did you get a sense of urgency as you were studying these folks of, look, I may live to 47 and I'm being chased and my information may not get out because I may be killed before it happens. Was there any sense of that in the whole story?
That's such a good question. It's kind of hard to get at because I didn't find that people actually articulate it. But I will say this, that one of the things that was a great, great advantage if you were a thinker was longevity. That, people, Hobbes lived a very long life. He was kind of a loser who, hadn't written much into I want to say maybe 60. Mm-hmm. Like he was really old for that time before he churned out his major work. Locke, churned out work, but was on the run. came back after the Glorious Revolution as a hero because he survived a long time. And, you have these other folks who kind of were super brilliant, had just as much talent, who, whatever, got the plague and died early. And, they're not as well remembered in history. So, take good care of yourself. If you have good ideas, we need you to hang around.
Very good. Your book tracks that relationship between scientific advancements, cultural beliefs, and the whole evolving understanding of the human mind and body. Can you share? You've talked about some of the highlights. Can you share some other highlights from that interaction between those different elements?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So, look, one of the things that I was reacting to in this book was that the only histories of the mind-body problem that I found before this were written by philosophers. And the philosophers would write about, this thinker had this position, and this thinker took this stance against them, and this thinker had that position. And it was all, kind of as if it was over, a tea at,
Right.
some sort of university. That wasn't the story I found at all. The story that I found was filled with, as you said, revolution, people living on the run, witchcraft claims, and the creation of something much bigger than a solution to the mind-brain problem, the creation of secular modernism. Because, what I argue is that this kind of pushing back between the soul and the body and opening up a space for the mind became the space in which secular modernity ended up thriving. And political modernity, in terms of democracy, ended up having a toehold. So there is no democratic, citizen unless you have a mind that has a will, and a will to make free choice to some level. And so this is important to this day. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford wrote a book called Determined, in which he's claiming, that we're utterly determined. We have no free will. He spent, I don't know how many years at his typewriter, I think, willing himself to write a book that we have no free will.
Yeah.
And it's a very dangerous conceit by these folks who think of themselves as super dedicated to science. One of the things in the book that I argue is there are different kinds of science, and they do different things. And so tell me what kind of science you're thinking about that eliminates the mind, and how committed you are to it, because you're certainly walking away from a lot of very obvious experience. So look, I think the idea here is that there was at the center of a lot of political change a different notion of what made us human. It wasn't just which religious belief did you have and what kind of soul did you have. It wasn't just that we had bodies. It was about this growing notion that minds, identities, selves, consciousness, that was the ground upon which groups and then nation states grew. And that is huge. That changes a lot in how you think about, what kind of, rights a citizen might have. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness all come from this, what is the pursuit of happiness if we're totally determined machines? There's nothing. The idea that all, we take these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's also part of it, because the mind is a kind of blank slate when you start. And so we all start equal. You might have inputs that are different because you live in China or India than my inputs. And that's cultural difference. That's not essential human difference. So in the beginning, it got perverted. But in the beginning, this is an anti-racist, anti-classist. We all start out of the same place. And those are, I think, really important outcomes that if you just tell the story through a philosophical lens, you don't get that at all. And that's what I really tried to capture in the book.
Let's stay on the free will concept for a minute. There's so much, and maybe it's just the world I'm living in, but there's so much attention from, as you indicated, many big thinkers who are coming out saying, well, nope, it's all determined. This nerve hits this and that creates this, and you really didn't have a choice in that perceived decision that you think you had. Just share your perspective on this beyond what you've already introduced, because it's a fascinating topic. We're not going to answer the question, but let's put another voice out there that's different from many of these folks that I'm kind of tired of hearing from, frankly.
Yeah, look, honestly, I think it's a really dumb debate. And I think it's amazing that these very brilliant people can say really dumb things because and the question is why, right? There was a review of Dennett's work. Dennett is one of the proponents of the, he has a more modest position on determinism, but he's pretty intense about the mind runs a movie that, is essentially chronically illusion. And Thomas Nagel, who's a brilliant philosopher, just said very softly, like, probably what this indicates is he is ideologically committed to his notion of science, not evidence. And so what in Soul Machine, what you find again and again is people who are so committed to science that they confuse what is knowable with what is real. I want to repeat that. They confuse what is knowable through their techniques with the only possible thing that's real. And that leads them to absurdity because science is a human-made process. I love science. My father was a scientist. I've been in the lab. My other, gig is at Rockefeller. I'm surrounded by scientists. It is a human endeavor that has ways of knowing. One of the things it's been super problematic with is inner experience, which you cannot see empirically and which you only know about indirectly. And so when you do your rat experiments, it's very hard to know what the inner experience of the rat is since it doesn't talk, So there's a lot that goes on in this determined kind of, I'm being courageous and telling you the scientific truth, man. You just got to accept it. And yet it's not the scientific truth. It's a very narrow way of thinking about science, and it's perverted in the sense that it's contradicted by so much experience that they have to say that all of that is, did I really choose a banana, not an orange for my lunch today because it was determined in advance in some time-space continuum that Einstein says is it's absurd. So I have very little patience for these folks because I think they're dangerous. What does it mean about things we need to do, like climate change? It's determined. I guess there's nothing to do.
Good point.
My fate as a human being, I guess that you see my point here. Yeah. That to say that our notions of free will are highly exaggerated is, I'm sure, right. I think we live with a more exaggerated sense of free will than we have. But to say that we have none is ludicrous.
Very well said. The phrase that I've been playing around with lately is freed will with a D on the end. Coming back to our physiology, if I sleep better, I'm more free to make different decisions than if I didn't sleep well. So I think there's something there, but I love the way you walked us through that. Couple more. This is so good. Let's do this. You close the book with such a powerful statement. I'm just going to read it out loud, and then I want to come back to sections of it. We pass through our waking hours secure in the distinctly modern belief that we possess the power to think, choose, sympathize, create, love, learn, wish, and remember. Thanks to a domain once known as the rational soul, but now called the mind. Within its invisible labyrinth, we exist, creators and inhabitants of our inner worlds, modern hybrids of soul and mind. Whew. You must have spent a month on that 3 sentences there. That was fantastic. I love that. Let's peel that out a little bit. The distinctly modern belief.
Yeah.
What is that?
This is a story that means it's historical, right? So that there's a history to this. It's distinctly modern. Well, look, I want the people who are listening to know that for historians, modern doesn't mean recent. Modern means there's a period that starts in with the scientific revolution in the, let's say, you can date it, let's say around 1600. So when I say modern, I'm going back a couple hundred years.
Right.
So modernity created this notion that there is this third way of defining human essence, and it's around our minds. And so that is distinctly modern in that sense.
The second thing that jumped off the page was the domain once known as the rational soul, but now called the mind. You've touched on this during our conversation.
Yeah.
Take us another layer deeper with that concept.
Well, maybe I should define it. So in antiquity, and then in Greek antiquity, but then woven into Christianity, there is this notion of a rational soul. And the rational soul was divided back in this period of time from two other souls. There was a vegetative soul that distinguished everything that was living from everything that was dead. It was mortal. It died. So when a plant died, that vegetative soul died. Fine. That was their way of thinking about it. There was a sensitive soul that distinguished animals and sentient things that had desire, that had emotions from the plant life. That sentient soul, that willing kind of that movement-oriented soul that animals had, plants didn't have. It was also mortal. It died. The third, and this is Thomas Aquinas who puts this together, and it lasts for like 600 years, is called the rational soul. The rational soul has the faculties of reason, memory, will, and it is immortal. It is the Christian soul that goes to heaven. It does not die when you die. So that was the rational soul that for many hundreds of years organized the way that humans were different from animals, and plant life had things in common because humans also had those other two souls. But humans had this added element that gave them eternal life if they were good Christians. So that is the backdrop for a very devout Calvinist named John Locke, and after a bunch of others who were maybe not so devout, like Thomas Hobbes, who was probably non-believer, Spinoza, some other people part of the story, right, start to pull away this notion of those functions in the rational soul are part of mind-brain activity. And you could still believe in an eternal life of the soul, but don't put those functions in there. Those are part of the natural world. And therefore, that kicks off the story of whether they can be healthy or ill. So that's why, the rational soul is, I'm pointing back way back to the beginning of the story with that going, like that was what it was pulled out of.
Healthy or ill and thus treatable.
And so you can't have mental health. You can't have mental illness. You can't have mental health treatments. It's all in the clergy. It's all theological at that point. It's being virtuous and not, succumbing to the vices that are articulated in theology. All of that was the way that you kept your soul pure and your soul from getting sick. Now it's being, pulled out into, if your reason is troubled, if your will is troubled, if your memory is troubled, we have to think about this in a mind-brain way, not a theological way.
Ah, good. Your practice as a psychiatrist, I was curious as I was reading this, did any of your findings, discoveries, things that you dug deeper into change your approach as a psychiatrist? That's a tough question. I think that it might have worked a little bit the other way around. I actually I worried about not bringing my contemporary biases to this story. And my contemporary biases are, I think I already told you that, I think that we need to be fluid and eclectic and think about the body and unconscious mind and conscious mind and the social environment, and that people who get too narrow and focus on one end up being ideologically rigid and dangerous at times. The perverse thing is they also are discoverers. Like the people who are like really deeply committed to one thing, they mostly are dangerous and filled with error. But sometimes they're the guy who, like, no doubt, he has no doubt, she has no doubt, they're actually
the inventing class too. So it's a complicated road to go down. Some of those people are the ones who, because they have no skepticism about their belief, push it so far that they actually go further than others. But that was part of the story, because some of the people that I talk about in this book are quite eccentric, and no one believes what they believe. They're weirdos, and Descartes was a weirdo. I mean, he moved around a lot. He didn't like other people mostly. I mean, he had, these were people who were slightly outside the mainstream, and that helped them think freely about things. Sometimes that took them to weird places. Sometimes it took them to really important places.
And you keep creating new questions in my head. Descartes, you emphasize he wasn't the only one, but he really exploited the ambiguity in the language, the French language, to make some points, but kind of softly, that people were like, "Oh, he doesn't really mean that." Can you describe what happened there, either with his example or others that were similar?
Yeah, I mean, look, Descartes was he is a fascinating guy, and he was a great mathematician, super brilliant, serious believer, and I think he saw that the notion of the rational soul was breaking down. He had a mentor named Mersenne who had a circle that he was part of. Mersenne saw the same thing. They embraced Galileo and mechanics, so the world is mechanical. And they said the only thing that can't be mechanical, of course, is the soul. How could, if the world is a clock, there's also someone who builds the clock. There's the clock maker. And so that, mechanics can explain the entire world, but not the soul. And Descartes becomes the guy who really firms up that point of view. Why? How does he do it? Well, instead of using faith to do it, he uses skepticism. And this is the critical thing about Descartes' early work. His "I think, therefore I am" comes after a series of thought experiments where he comes to the conclusion through logic and skepticism that seems to indicate that it just has to be that way, and that thought is an inner experience that is not related to the body, and that therefore we have a body. And then we have this non-material cogito, this conscious experience. So therefore, in the Cartesian world, there's no mental health or mental illness. The big thing for him was he couldn't figure out how the immaterial cogito would possibly control the material brain, since it seemed he was claiming it did, and he came to this rather ludicrous conclusion that the pineal gland, which is a tiny thing in the middle of the brain, was the seat of the soul, and that's where they met. And this led to a lot of mockery, even at the time, but certainly later, that he had kind of made this up. So he's a quite brilliant thinker who I think backed into this position in part because of his Christianity and his deep belief. And at first the church hated him because they just wanted the old doctrine. But when they saw that the old doctrine was breaking down, they latched on to him. I think that maybe your question is there was a shift in France from Descartes a heretic to Descartes our guy.
Last question, and thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Our listeners are focused on health, wellness, performance. It's 2024. Where do you see the application, and maybe this is tied a little bit to the think tank, where do you see the application of what we're learning from your book to mental health and mental well-being in this age right now?
Yeah. Look, I think the book is a call for kind of a détente between these kind of silly competing arguments between mind, brain, and soul, to say that, we can all, if we understand the meaning of all of those terms and we give them all their own purview, their own domain, that we can think about all of them. I say in the book, I work in a hospital. I know what it's like to be terrified and be near death's door. And I know that people summon their spiritual life in those moments, and I don't underestimate it. So that's part of, I think humans have done that, as long as we have written history. It doesn't have to impede on the notion of the mind, which also has its domain and interacts with the brain. And so I think these reductionist arguments, either like we're all brain, or, there's a lot of like Christian over, extension into the realm of the mind. I think if we all kind of keep things in their right lanes, we can kind of appreciate how complex human interiority is, and make progress by attempting to push the ball forward in these incredibly complex problems, right? If the brain is the most complex object we know in nature, the brain, this emergent property that we know as the mind, that so much of our lives and our culture are built on, it has so many mysteries in it. And then, the realm of the soul is literally one of mystery. So we have to be really kind of both dogged in trying to pursue knowledge, and then really humble about how much we know and how much we don't know. A book that says that we are wholly determined is arrogant in the extreme by not really attempting to, acknowledge how limited our knowledge is. And, look, I'm a psychiatrist. People come to me, they come for answers. They don't come for uncertainty. And so I understand we need to take a stab at what we know and use pattern recognition and new science all the time. I'm always in favor of new science. That's good science. But what I really don't like is the overextension of, of claims from anybody. Psychoanalysts used to do it by making huge claims about what they could know. Today, geneticists are doing it every day. And we get we just found a new gene that may, the key is the conditional phrase. Right. It might be the source of Alzheimer's or schizophrenia. Well, it might, but it might not. And then it turns out it's not. Right. It's one of 240 genes. And we have an amazing symphony genetically that then, results in an even more complex symphony of physiologic changes that then has these emergent properties that we call the mind that are in a environment and a social world that has huge impact. So if we're looking for one cause, we're mostly screwed. And if we're looking for one cause, we're mostly stupid. I mean, look, go for it. Find the gene for whatever you can find. But we can have a cadre of people doing that. But mostly we have to think about interactions and complex systems. And the more we understand about that, the more we'll give people better advice about how to live their lives.
Love it. What a great way to wrap. Dr. Makari, thank you so much. This is fantastic.
Thanks, Brad. It's been fun.
Thank you for joining us here on the Catalyst 360 podcast. If you're a regular listener, you've heard me mention the best-in-class coaching services available to employers, EAPs, and wellness service providers through Catalyst Coaching 360. But why does it matter? Isn't all coaching basically the same? Not a chance. For most providers, it's a secondary add-on, and it shows in both the outcomes and the engagement levels. There's only one national provider focusing exclusively on coaching and has been doing that for 18 years. And that's Catalyst. Curious about options? Reach out anytime. Results at catalystcoaching360.com or visit the website catalystcoaching360.com. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Catalyst Coaching 360, Dr. Brad Cooper. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.